Ever since I was young, I've loved listening to elderly people talk about their lives. Through them, I heard countless strange and fascinating stories, the kind that are hard to believe at first, yet somehow impossible to doubt when they're told by people you trust, people who lived through those moments themselves. My late grandmother Margaret, may she rest in peace, spent her entire life in a remote northern village, surrounded by endless forests. Even in her old age, she remained sharp, clear-minded, and certain in her memories. When I was just a boy, she would share with me stories, strange, unsettling, sometimes impossible to explain. I even tried asking others from nearby towns whether those stories were true. But the answer was always the same. Yes, it's true. We've known about it for years. We've seen things too. She wasn't the kind of person to exaggerate or invent things. She was grounded, practical. If she told you something, it meant it happened. And I, just a kid back then, absorbed every word like a sponge, memorizing it all. In the late 1980s, when I was about 10, I often stayed with her in the village. I remember those long winter evenings, sitting by the window, staring at the snowdrifts, listening to the fire crackling in the stove, waiting for her to finish her chores. And when she finally sat down beside me, gently running her hand through my hair, she would begin. Stories about the past, about people, about the forest. And sometimes, what she remembered felt so vivid that I would forget to breathe. One story stayed with me more than any other. It happened in the winter of 1950, a winter unlike anything we know today. Back then, the cold was relentless, deep, biting, endless, the kind of cold that made even the oldest pine trees groan under the weight of the wind. My grandmother was young then, just over 20. She lived in a small settlement surrounded by forest, where life followed a simple rhythm. Summers in the fields, autumns gathering berries and mushrooms, winters spent visiting relatives in neighboring villages. That morning, in the bitter cold, some neighbors gave her a ride by sled to a nearby village across the river. She never quite remembered why she went. Perhaps to visit an aunt. She took care of her errands, spent some time there. But when it was time to leave, there was no one left to take her back. The others had already gone, and no more sleds were expected. So she stepped to the edge of the village, looked out at the dark wall of forest, and made her decision. She would go alone, following a narrow path she had known since childhood, cutting straight through the woods. She believed she would be home in an hour and a half at most. The weather that morning had been calm, cold, but still. She entered the forest and began walking along the familiar trail. At first, everything felt normal, but gradually the sky began to change. The pale winter light faded, the sun disappeared behind thick clouds, and the wind picked up, slowly at first, then stronger. Soon, snow began to fall. Light flakes at first, then heavier, thicker, until they blurred her vision and swallowed the path beneath her feet. She quickened her pace, trying to stay on track while she still could, but the snowfall only intensified. Before long, the trail vanished completely. Everything around her turned white, identical, unfamiliar, disorienting. She tried to rely on memory, turning one way, then another, hoping to reach the river. But the forest stood like a wall, the trees all looking the same. And after some time, she realized she was lost. The wind grew stronger, turning into a sweeping ground blizzard, and the cold, once manageable, began to cut deep into her bones. She kept moving, stumbling, falling, forcing herself back to her feet again and again. But with every step, her strength faded. When darkness finally fell, she stopped. There was no point in going any further. Her legs refused to carry her. She leaned back against a thick pine tree, slowly slid down its trunk, and sat there in the snow. The cold began to take her warmth. Breathing became harder. Her thoughts grew distant and scattered. And in that moment, she understood. This was the end. In desperation, she began to pray, truly pray, the way she had been taught as a child. The words came back to her on their own, rising from somewhere deep in memory, and she whispered them into the dark, frozen air. And then, something moved. Her attention was drawn to a shape on a nearby tree, about 100 feet away. A figure was slowly climbing down from the trunk. It was not tall, perhaps 5 feet at most, but solid, human-like, covered entirely in thick, pale fur. She had never seen anything like it before, and had no idea what it could be. The creature looked at her, and then made a gesture with its hand, or perhaps a paw, as if inviting her to follow. She had no choice. Stay where she was and freeze, or follow something she could not understand. With trembling hands, she made the sign of the cross, whispered a short prayer, struggled to her feet, and began to walk toward it. The creature waited for her. When she came closer, it turned and began to move, walking forward with quiet confidence without ever looking back, leaving a narrow path behind it in the deep snow. She followed, stumbling, falling, pushing herself onward, and whenever she stopped, unable to go further, it would pause and wait patiently until she gathered enough strength to continue. They walked in silence, and then suddenly the forest ended. Ahead of her, faint lights appeared. A village. Windows glowed warm and yellow in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, dogs were barking. The creature stopped. It raised its arm and pointed toward the houses, then turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing almost instantly into the swirling snow. She stood there, unable to believe what she had just seen. She could not remember how they had crossed the river, or climbed the hills, or how long they had been walking. All that remained in her memory was the path, and the silent figure ahead of her. She made her way home, opened the gate, stepped inside, and without even taking off her clothes, collapsed onto the bed, clutching an icon to her chest, and fell into a deep, heavy, dreamless sleep. The next morning, after warming up and drinking the hot tea, she told everything. By evening, the whole village knew. The elders said little, only exchanged glances, quietly shaking their heads. And only one very old woman finally spoke. There are things in the forest, all kinds of things. Not all of them are bad. You were lucky. My grandmother never forgot that night. Not the fear, but the questions. Who was it? Why did it help her? How did it know where to go? There are still no answers, only the story. And the quiet feeling that the world is far deeper than we think, and that sometimes, when there is nothing left, help comes from places we would never expect.